Thank you. Mr. Clerk, please let's call this meeting, the Providence City Council as a whole to order. And please let's call the roll.
Council President Matos.
Present.
Councilman Correa.
Present.
Councilman Espinal.
Present.
Councilman Igliozzi.
Present.
Councilman Narducci. Councilman Narducci is absent. Councilman Salvatore. Councilman Salvatore is absent. Councilman Taylor.
Here.
Councilwoman Anthony.
Present.
Councilwoman Castillo.
Present.
Councilwoman Harris. Councilwoman Harris is absent. Councilwoman Kerwin.
Present.
Councilwoman LaFortune.
Present.
Councilor Miller.
Present.
Councilwoman Ryan. Councilwoman Ryan is absent. You are all set with the quorum. You have 1, 2, 3 absent.
Thank you.
Yep.
So before we get into the details of the meeting, I just want to ask the solicitor to please put into the record the legality of this meeting.
Yes, Madam President. Based upon Governor Raimondo's executive order suspending the open meeting requirements that we meet in person, this meeting can be held via Zoom or any other similar device via the internet. So this is consistent with the governor's order several months ago due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, could you please read the first item into the record?
Actually, sorry, Council President, I would just like to reflect for the record that Councilman Salvatore is present. He had dialed in via phone, and I'm unmuting him right now.
Okay. Madam Clerk, please make note of that. Madam Clerk, could you please read the first item into the record?
Providence Public School budget presentation.
Thank you. We have several guests from the Providence School Department that are here to do this presentation on their budget. I would like to ask the Superintendent Harrison Peters to please introduce himself and introduce your team that is here with you for the benefit of the council members. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam President. Good evening, Council. We're excited and thrilled to be here. I'm Harrison Peters. Been on the ground less than 90 days, but feel like we've done 9 years worth of work. We're excited to bring a balanced budget to you tonight for your reactions and feedback. The team that you'll be hearing mostly from this evening would be myself, Arthur Nevins, my Chief of Staff, and then leading sort of the technical pieces will be Zach Scott. He's our Chief Operations Officer. But also in this space, I wanted to acknowledge Laura Hart, our communications comms person, and Victor Capion from RIDE is also with us this evening because a lot of the work that we do, all the work that we do is aligned with the RIDE's mission, and he'll be able to field some of those questions that are RIDE specific, Madam President. So I think that's the team that we have, and we're again excited to bring this conversation to the council.
Thank you. Are you guys ready to do the presentation? Do you want to, do you have a statement before starting the presentation? And Sean, are you ready to present?
I'm ready as soon as they finish their introduction.
Okay, perfect.
We're ready to jump right in. and just have the conversation whenever you're ready, Madam President. We can jump right in because I know that there could potentially be considerable discussion. So I want to make sure we can try to get through as much of the presentation as possible.
Sure. I just want to acknowledge the Majority Leader Ryan is present.
Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. So Sean, can you go ahead with the presentation, please?
Sorry, which presenter would like to have control?
So I'll start off. This is Harrison, Sean. I'll start off and I do the first 5 or 6 slides. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Give this the control to Zach. I apologize. Zach Scott.
Hopefully, Zach, that format is okay. It might be better if I actually share the application. Hold on, let me see, so that it's not, it wants to put me in presentation mode. Let's go ahead and try that though, and see how it works. So Zach, should be all yours. I don't see how you, yep, you're in control.
All right. Well, again, good evening, folks. Really, really excited to be here, Council. Before we jump into sort of the technical pieces of the budget and really talking about the money and how we've got it allocated and what our intentions around our priorities, I thought it was important that we tee up this conversation in a couple ways. First of all, we want to be very clear that the conversation today rests on transparency. We want to be very clear with the public how we're spending the money. It's important that we get feedback from you and your constituents around the priorities that guide our schools, and wanted to share some high value investments that we would appreciate your support in thinking about how we can move Providence youth to the next level of academic sort of learning. So those are the things that we want to be able to land tonight in way of objectives. Our next slide, really just quick, we want to talk about our budget philosophy, the why around the budget and why we built it the way that we did. A bit of an overview, and then some budget details that we think will enter into a really good discussion, a rich discussion around finalizing the priorities for the district. So next slide, it's no secret. We've all been introduced to this thinking around the Johns Hopkins report. They called out some very specific things around our way of work. We thought that they were critical enough for us to sort of surface those things, because I want to be very clear on how we've designed this budget and what we've learned and what we've leaned into as our priority. So we're thinking about like, how do we get here? And I don't have to rehash these, but the second slide I think is important. Ernst and Young also did a bit of an analysis on the school district, and they came out with 3 key findings that we thought were pretty significant. One was that we operated our budget from a very fixed perspective, and we really didn't align ourselves for the opportunities to make meaningful change. So thinking about how can we have a fluid budget that also morphs to the needs of schools and very interactive and reactive with the needs of schools. The second part is how we need to reinvest resources and allocation in some of our most litigious communities, more specifically our English language learners. So in the budget, you'll see where we've got a few recommendations of how we want to increase the support for that community of learners. And then the other piece is just driving to efficient. We want to make sure that we have a very lean, agile organization. So I'll also bring some recommendations, Madam President, where we are looking to significantly reduce the size of central office and push people, time, and money closer to the schools so they can make those decisions. We heard those recommendations from Ernst and Young really clear, and we're in a position to operationalize some of those recommendations. This slide, I want to just, before I talk, I just want you to just look at this slide and just sort of take it in for about 30 seconds. The reason that I wanted to tee this slide up tonight is because this represents sort of our outputs. When you look at any company, any agency, you're theoretically evaluated by the product that you produce. In our situation as a public school system, we are prepared, we're supposed to be prepared to produce graduates, citizens ready to step in college, career, military, whatever your post-secondary ventures are. Our role is to prepare you. So if you think about the Coca-Cola bottling company, if you go to a Coke machine and put in $2 and get a Coke and you pull out a bottle and you open it and it tastes like something else, you're not going to be in business long. This is what we've looked at very deeply and hard as we designed our budget. We want to make sure that we are aligning our spending and our priorities to change this. The reality is this doesn't happen when you get to high school. There are a lot of things that happen prior to that. But the reason that I wanted to tee this slide up because it speaks volume. It's not the Ernst and Young report. It's not the it's not the John Hopkins report. This is us. This is our performance. We own this. So in designing the budget with my team, you'll see specifically how we've outlined priorities specifically to get at this, but also mitigate this by coming together with some early learning opportunities. How do we transform middle schools and how do we transform elementary schools? But I thought it was very important that we set the context of this conversation through this slide. And partly is because our students are literally waiting on us. Our next slide talks a little bit about my transition. So I transitioned in on February 20th, and I had what I believe an aggressive entry plan to hit the ground learning versus hit the ground running. A few of the early commitments that I made was to reorganize central office to better support the needs of schools. I felt, and there was data to support that we were a large lumbering bureaucracy and we didn't necessarily morph to the daily needs of school. So how do we transition to a smaller, leaner, agile central office that understands what school support looks like? Moving up teacher hiring by a month and a half has been phenomenal for us. In times past, we would still be waiting another week before we can even start to hire teachers externally. By the end of May, beginning of June, you know that most of the hiring of, you know what's out there. So we've been hiring for about 3 weeks and it has significantly changed the game. We're able to compete with some of our partners around the state and quite frankly, around the nation. So this has been a game changer for us being able to move the hiring timeline up. And Zach can talk about some numbers later. Vendor contracts. We just had hundreds of vendor contracts that weren't really aligned to mission critical or priority. So we've looked at every vendor contract and tried to realign. Does this contract, A, meet the requirements of what we believe is a quality service? And also, does it align to the priorities? And I want to go back to that slide that I talked about a few minutes ago of that high school data. Does those contracts get at changing the trajectory of those outcomes? We are making a significant purchase in our ELA curriculum. We're going to have a district-wide curriculum that's high quality that we're really, really excited about. It is an extremely large purchase, but we believe it's the right and equitable thing to do. So we're also going to bring that forward to the council for review as well. Next slide. Coming into this district, you think about, okay, how do you get your arms? What is that progression? What should that sort of progression look like? So in any labor-intensive organization, I've sort of outlined what I believe the systematic steps to put us sort of on a trajectory to where we're a high-performing school district. And if you notice, the budget conversation comes as a result of a lot of other work and inputs happening. So theoretically, you should be very clear around the direction of the district, very focused on your priorities and your big rocks, and then you align your budget to that. Some mistakes we've made in the past, we just sort of plugged and played the budget and sort of hoped that the strategy would match. And that was evidenced out in the Ernst and Young report. So we wanted to be very intentional and strategic around how we use the budget and is it used to drive the priorities, which is steeped in student learning. So like most organizations, we've landed on what we believe is a draft theory of action. So people talk about what's that elevator speech? What is the district all about? What should I expect? What am I going to get behind and follow? Quite frankly, this is it. And if you look at the bottom of sort of the building, those are the foundational pillars that we're trying to build this house. Stakeholder engagement and community partnerships. We believe strongly, and we can't do this work by ourselves. And then the piece of how do we use data? Do we have actionable real-time data to make decisions that are in the best interest of students? How can equity be that through line and that engine that drives everything we do? How do we ensure that every student, every school gets what they need just in time? And then I've talked about a couple times just looking at central office and redesign it so it can be more responsive to the needs of families and students. When you look at that foundation, on that foundation sets 4 key pillars, and these are very familiar. A coherent academic vision, and we started that by the purchasing of a high quality curriculum. World-class talent, how do we get the best professionals in front of our teachers, and how do we ensure that they're developed, they're trained, and they're skillful as they can be. Student supports, I talked about the multilingual learners, our differently able. How do we ensure that they're getting what they need? And then empowerment. How do we give decision-making back to parents and communities and school leaders? Again, central office can't run schools effectively from central office. You can manage schools, but you can't run them. So how do you push the decision-making and resources closer to the communities? And sort of as a roofing piece, is how do we provide high quality options across our entire city? Parents shouldn't have to roll a dice and hope to get a great school. They should be able to close their eyes, pick a school, and it should be a high quality option. And then going back to that slide around the high school data, how do we ensure that when you walk across that stage, that diploma that we give you carries the full weight and value that we believe you earn for being in school 12 to 13 years. Coming up to the end of sort of this tee up, what we've been able to surface is what's important. What are we going to measure? What are we going to be held accountable for? So what you're seeing on this slide are some very high level power metrics. So when we have these public facing conversations, we want to be held accountable to these metrics. The reality is these aren't the only metrics that we're going to monitor or be held accountable for. There are a litany of others that we can talk to and talk about, but when we talk about the ones that rise to the surface, these are the power metrics that we believe should be public facing and are mission critical that we want to make sure that we monitor publicly as well. Visual representation of what we believe the footprint of central office and RIDE should be. We wanted to invert this triangle and put the folks that matter most on top. And as you can see, students and families matter most, and that's how we should leverage and support everything that we build out. And those side sort of ancillary pieces where you see business partnerships and community partners, they wrap around the entire pyramid because they have the ability to serve up and down the pyramid. But the goal of this is just to pictorially show what we believe the footprint of a central office should be and who the triangle should support. And at the end of the day, students and families are at the top of the pyramid, driving the change and giving us feedback. This slide, I don't think anything on this slide is new to anyone. We know that we are facing a significant budget crisis. One of the taglines said that we are near an $800 million deficit at the state level. And I think it may be a little bit larger now. But if we take that number of 800 million, we know that that's the entire educational budget for the state of Rhode Island. That goes without saying that we're going to have some significant financial challenges. That's why I think this budgeting cycle and the need for us to get it right is absolutely necessary. So just by the mere fact of this slide calling out not only where we are as a state, as a city, but as a nation, it necessitates that we are very strategic and very clear and transparent and very focused on how we spend our budget to ensure that they are keenly aligned to the priorities that we set. I'm going to transition the conversation to Zach. We're going to sort of get into a little bit of the technical work. Zach, are you ready to sort of take it from here?
I am, and thank you, Harrison, and good evening, everyone on the call. With that set up, to frame how we then think about our budget is really building off of the work Harrison just mentioned. So prioritizing investments in those areas that we believe are necessary for district transformation and district improvement. In areas where we do need to make reductions, doing those with the eye towards minimizing the impact on student learning in the classroom. And then lastly, doing this all in an area or a time of economic uncertainty. So wanting to ensure, we are planning for the multiple scenarios that may come our way. So with that, I'll start to dig in a little bit to the budget overview and then into the details. So just no surprise to folks on the call, our local budget is driven by two main sources, state aid and city aid. Our state aid primarily comes through the funding formula, which is driven by enrollment and the percentage of our students that are qualified for free and reduced lunch. And we also have several line items or categorical funds, either special education or English language learners, for an example, that contribute to our budget. City aid is something that is calculated slightly different under the Crowley Act. So under the Crowley Act, the city of Providence is obligated to increase funding by the same percentage as the state's total aid to Rhode Island schools is increased. So that is how we've been, planning and calculating the city contribution, which is in many ways tied to what the state contribution is. So what I'll turn now in a second is looking at, based on the governor's proposal and the March enrollment data, what our enrollment revenue projections are, knowing, and we'll talk through this in detail, that that state revenue is, as Harrison alluded to, is still very much up in the air. So we'll talk through how we're planning to deal with the multiple revenue scenarios and then the implications to our costs and expenditures. So taking what was the governor's proposal in January and including the March enrollment updates that the state provides, Providence was expecting to receive approximately $15.7 million in revenue from state and city sources. So primarily that is state aid and funding formula aid, where you see a net increase of around $8.5 million. The city aid obligation is calculated at roughly $5.8 million, and that is driven by the statewide increase in aid of 4.4%. In addition to that, there is also an proposed increase in the ELL categorical funding that was included in the governor's proposal. So like I alluded to, this is what we had been initially planning on and helped drive how we thought of our budget throughout the winter and spring and how we're planning for investments. And we'll talk through those in a second, but we need to be prepared for the multiple paths and the uncertainty that lies ahead of us. So what I'm going to transition to now is to talk through planned expenditures, and that'll set us up to say, when we look at our planned expenditures, knowing that our revenue may change, if there's an increase, how will we invest that additional money? And if there's a decrease, how will we close any remaining gap there is in funding? So here is is our starting point as we plan for our FY21 budget. And what you'll see is, as a starting point, is this $5 million baseline cost increase. And primarily what is going into that are increases in salaries for staff who are part of a collective bargaining unit that already is under agreement, any increases in our kind of standard service contracts, and a big driver as well as benefits and retirement. So just as a starting point, that leads to the roughly $5 million in increase that we're seeing here. In addition, as we were building our staffing plans late in the winter, in January and February, one of the things we've seen historically is that Providence had not adequately planned for late entrance to our classrooms. So we have a number of students who enter throughout the year, many of whom are multilingual learners, and seats may have been full on day one, but we struggled to find appropriate placements for those students. So using some historical enrollment data, we identified grade levels I think it was primarily 4th, 5th, and 9th grade, where we saw an influx of students and added additional seat capacity to ensure we had appropriate support for those students as they arrived. So that required an investment in classrooms, and that increased our baseline cost increased by roughly $1 million to close to $6 million. So that's kind of our starting point. We then took that and looked at some of our planned deficit reduction activities, some of which Harrison had mentioned earlier. And I'll touch on a few here in a little detail. So one is the central office reorganization that we are currently in the process of, where we're projecting between the central office reorganization and kind of non-personnel spending reduction in central office, roughly $1 million in savings. We also had identified or were not appropriately utilized, and that led to further reductions there. We also took, as we always do, a hard look at our transportation costs, and we identified some of our out-of-district transportation, which has been growing at a pretty high clip. We believe that there are schools that operate right outside of the Providence border that we can actually operate under our contract rather than a statewide transportation contract. And given the rate differential, we'd actually see some good savings there. So taking all those items in the full list here, that translated to roughly $2.3 million in cost reduction activities, resulting in a revised expenditure increase for FY21 of roughly $3.6 million. Now, what I'll talk through next is in a scenario where we see an increase in revenue, the areas we'd invest in. And if we receive that full 15.7 million, that would be around 12 million in investments. And then I'll talk through a scenario where we need to close the gap of the 3.6 million we have here and what we might need to do that if we don't receive additional revenue. So to talk through some of the investments here, and I'll have Harrison chime in because this is driven by his vision and the where we need to go as a district. So you'll see some of we've aligned our investments with those areas we believe are important to district transformation that Harrison highlighted earlier on. So I'll call out a few here that have been top of mind for us. So there are a few around supporting Department of Justice settlement agreement around increasing coaches at our high schools to provide professional development to staff, as well as increasing assessment and translation services. We also believe, expanding RIPTA access, public transportation access, can improve attendance for high school students. So that is something we would prioritize as well. And the last thing I'd flag here is just increasing social emotional support for our students, and here in the form of additional social workers for our students. When we look at areas of talent and infrastructure, so talent is increasing our principal pipeline and principal development, knowing that, as schools as a fundamental unit of change, the leadership is incredibly important. So making sure we bring in and retain great leaders in the district. We've already, as Harrison mentioned, started to make progress on reducing teacher vacancies, but we know kind of sustained work here is needed to ensure we're getting the best talent into Providence. The last thing I mentioned is just enhancing the district's data warehouse capacities. We want to ensure, in all areas of the organization, from the classroom to the head of school to the central office, that we are using student data and other data to really drive decisions. So really trying to enhance our capacities there. But I'll ask Harrison to weigh in here as well.
Just really quick. One of the things that I asked the team was about these initial investments that you've seen on the past few slides. And I had to have a frank moment with the team because I've worked in, obviously, my history. I've worked in a number of districts around the country, but I've quite frankly not seen a district yet to not have these items in place. These are just basic investments that I would call mission critical, necessities and not niceties. I can't imagine a world in a school district that every school doesn't have an assistant principal. A data warehouse where people, teachers and leaders can be responsive to the needs of students. These are just basic functional things that I think make healthy school districts. and we've got to figure out how do we invest in these much needed investments. Just having coaches who support the work. How do we support our multilingual learners? I think that as we look at where we're headed, how we set priorities, these have to surface as mission critical investments just to have a healthy school system. So part of the ask, and so I think part of the thought partnering is how do we ensure that we can sort of make good on these investments that are mission critical to the district.
Thank you. So summary of where we see we need to invest as a district, and what I'll transition to next is in the scenario where we don't receive that the revenue, or we need to make additional reductions to fund some of these investments. What we might need to where we might need to take action. So so here are some items that we would pursue. Again, to either if revenue came in flat, or if we need to fund some of the investments we identified on the previous slide. So the first is school level reductions, and these would be to personnel at the school level, which we have sought to avoid throughout this process, as well as doing some school schedule consolidation. So that would be thinking or scheduling schools or combining school schedules to minimize and ideally reduce positions to close the gap here. Two other items around a non-union salary freeze, so no step or cost of living increase, and a potential 5-day employee furlough. The last item you'll see is a FY20 fund transfer, and that is using what we see as a projected surplus to cover the remaining gap for FY21, which is not ideal, but we think is necessary to proceed. A few more items that I'll highlight just for context here, because I want to transition a bit to reentry, which is a kind of a different conversation, but is certainly on top of minds for all of us, and certainly some significant budget implications. So a couple pieces of context: we are obviously in open negotiations with the PT, the Providence Teachers Union, and so any contract. Any contract will have a financial impact that we would need to ensure is captured in our budget. The scenarios, the kind of range of things we've talked about here has been the 15.7 million increase in flat revenue. We're also cognizant that there could be a scenario where revenue is actually decreased by the state, and so that is something we are conscious of, and we'll need to plan for if it comes to that. Lastly, and this will transition to the next slide, we do anticipate stimulus funding being provided to Providence from the federal government. However, a lot of that I think is going to be used towards covering additional costs that are created as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll talk briefly about how we're thinking about that and some of the budget implications. I'll quickly close with some budget details for reference, but then we obviously want to make sure we have time for a rich discussion here. So when we're planning for the start of, we're kind of in the midst of this now, planning for the start of the next school year, several key goals that really guide our work. Obviously, first and foremost is keeping our students and employees safe as we return to school, but really also anticipating multiple scenarios for school opening, whether that means school opening looking different for different grade levels, different subject areas, different student populations, is something we need to plan for, as well as adapting to learning environments for various events throughout the year. So how do we plan as health conditions change throughout the year, positively or negatively, and how do we react and plan for that in advance? And then the lastly is just throughout this being conscious of being equitable and focusing on the variety of needs that our students have, so that we have a plan that meets those needs and is not necessarily one size fits all. So that drives then how we then plan operationally. So first is identifying high priority PP&E technology and other items for immediate purchase, which we are in the process of doing and procuring immediately, even without perfect clarity. We know we'll need Chromebooks, hand sanitizer, and so we're trying to move quickly on those for the start of school year. As we get a more robust plan for the start, we are trying to then use that instructional model, knowing it may vary by grade level, by school or subject, and then using that to drive our operational and financial implications. So however instruction looks like, whether it's hybrid, in-person, virtual, and knowing that it may look different across grade levels and across the district, using that to then drive how we make operational and financial decisions. So throughout this, we are, it is important to get feedback on the front end and the back end, and we are trying to do that, while obviously being swift and decisive, given the importance of opening school in a productive way. So to highlight a few things here that have financial implications, some of which we are, in the process of and have developed estimates on, some of which will, we'll get clarity on as we get a plan. So technologies obviously will be a need. We've provided a lot of technology out to students at the end of this year, which I think was very successful, but we know we'll have some that are lost or damaged and we'll need to replace, as well as increase just our capacity there. PPE and sanitization supplies are already in process. And then a few other ones that are obviously really important to do in a timely fashion, given the lead time, but potential need for additional staff if class sizes are changed, potential need for facilities changes, putting up barriers or some other construction to help ensure those spaces are safe. And then lastly, transportation and the potential for capacity limitations on public transportation, on our own yellow school buses, and thinking what that means for additional school capacity or bus capacity. So we are anticipating to receive, $14.4 million in ESSER funding, some of which will need to go to private and parochial schools, but the remaining is what we think we'll need to, spend really on some of the additional costs that come from the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll quickly just show quickly the different scenarios around revenue and what one of the scenarios looks like from a high level on expenditures, but then we want to open it up for discussion from the group. So here is a similar chart to what you saw before, except it includes scenario 2, where we show the different revenue possibilities here, and you'll note the fund transfer that increases expenditures by roughly $1 million from FY20 to FY21. And it didn't, the part of this chart is not showing up, unfortunately, but what you'll see, I'll try to walk through it. This is breaking down, it's looking at scenario 2 and talks through the different categories of spend. So that big blue bar is what you see for salary and benefits. I believe that 20% is supplies or services. And then some of the smaller items you see there are hardware and equipment. So it's more just a high level view of what our expenditure breakdown is under that scenario 2. So with that, obviously a lot that we've gone through, and we're happy to answer questions on anything, and can certainly flip back and refer to other spots that people may have questions on.
Thank you, Zach. With that, I would like to open the floor for discussions. Any council member would like to ask a question? Is anyone raising their hands, Sean, that you can see?
Yes, Chairman Igliozzi.
Chairman Igliozzi?
Thank you, Madam President. I have a couple of questions. I noticed that you mentioned, and it traditionally is the budget driver, the salaries and benefits, 76.5%. Also, I know that under the state statute that you have the ability to unilaterally change collective bargaining agreements. My question is, why haven't you begun, I see you've begun process to negotiate, but what are you negotiating to do? As you know, the teachers received the $9 million worth of raises last year. And your budget driver is salaries and benefits. What specific items and changes are you looking to change in the collective bargaining agreement? And also, if the union disagrees, you do have the ability to unilaterally change it by law. So tell me what you're looking to try to get from the unions at this time. And then if they don't participate in a willing manner, what is your next step to address that aspect?
I will have Victor. I think Victor Capion is still on. I think he's able to speak from the commissioner perspective around what we believe with regards to her authority under the Crowley Act and how the bargaining conversation is headed. I think you're on mute, Victor.
Victor's muted.
How about
All
now?
right, now.
Perfect.
Yes.
All right, and like, sorry, thank you, Superintendent. Mr. Chairman, in regards to your question, we have just begun the process of negotiating with the Providence Teachers Union. So we are just starting that process. Our goal initially is to come to an agreement with the Teachers Union that we believe will be one that will be in the benefit of our students, but also that will be in the benefits of our educators as well. So right now we are just in the beginning of that process. We will be able to sort of see how the process unfolds, but we are negotiating in good faith with the Teachers Union. And so we're going to give that time to proceed and to go through the negotiations. In terms of what could happen after that, not ready to answer that at this point. We are just starting the process right now.
So my question is that since the budgets are looming in the state level and the city level, did you guys put a time frame on whether or not you were going to achieve any savings with the teachers union prior to that discussion? And it seems to me that if you're looking for everybody else to tighten their belt and give you more money, but the biggest driving factor is the teachers unions and costs, it seems to me that you should have a time frame on when you are going to get something. Are you looking to try to achieve $5 million worth of savings from them, $10 million worth of savings from them, $1 million worth of savings? And then just as a dovetail, you mentioned you're talking about furloughing non-union people. I think it said, right? Non-union furloughs, is that what it was? Furloughing people. Who are you furloughing? And then what about, I presume you're not gonna furlough teachers, but I presume you're gonna cut their pay. So what's the time frame? I'm glad you guys are trying to work with them, but it seems that we're all in a expedited process now or time frame where we need to have more solid answers. And that seems to be an answer, something you can get a solid answer to like sooner than later, because it's based on what you both can give and take each other. It's either you're gonna do it or you're not. And just like the Crowley Act superimposes an automatic obligation upon the people of Providence and the taxpayers to give you more money, as you guys portray, that it also gives the school, your district now, the ability to unilaterally change contracts. So, I'd like to hear some concrete numbers, and what number are you trying to achieve from them? What are you trying to get? What value, what money?
The goal of the negotiations is to do in an expedited, and the commission has been very clear in terms of being aggressive in terms of a timeline that we can move this forward as soon as possible. The union has also come to the table and have said that they are also willing to negotiate as soon as possible. And so right now, that is the work that we are doing. We do not have a number that available at this time that can be something to share. We don't have that number. And so we are aware in terms of the Crowley Act and what it offers, not just in terms of the budget, but also in terms of all the other opportunities. But right now we are working with the teachers union and have entered the process of negotiations.
Mr. Chairman, also, I think that we've also have some very significant asks at the bargaining table. We're asking an increase from 1 professional development day to almost an upwards of 13 professional development days. That's one of the biggest issues that I think hampers our ability to move the school district. The other piece is changing the hiring practices. The other piece that we're looking at is, quite frankly, being able to move on poor performers. All of those things have been sort of obstacles that we've faced in the past. So we've got some very aggressive asks that we believe will set us on a pace to transform this district. And we also want to negotiate in good faith with the union, because we definitely understand that teachers' working conditions are student learning conditions. And the commissioner is I think she's been really open about her willingness to use the Crowley Act or leverage that. But we also wanted to have a good bargaining season with that group, just because the stakes are so high and the asks that we're asking for teachers is pretty significant as well.
Superintendent, do you believe that you'll be able to transition that contract from a industrial-based contract to performance-based contract?
So we believe that the union has come to us in good faith, and we want to, and they've expressed high interest to get a workable contract in a very short period of time. We've had good discussions. I don't want to get into the particulars. And I think there's clarity around we have to do things differently. The option of what we've done in the past is just simply not an option. So I think we bring that spirit to the table. And we've had some very aggressive conversations on both sides. But what we've tried to do is ensure, as we lead through these negotiations, that children are at the center of these conversations. So I think that we'll get to a good place. And again, we want to be respectful to teachers and the work that they do. My goodness, during these times, teachers are just doing yeoman's work. But we also know that we don't have a contract right now that's student-centered, and that needs to change.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Chairman. Councilwoman LaFortune?
Hi, thank you so much, Superintendent Harrison, for the presentation. I truly appreciate it. I do have a few questions. So one, you mentioned in the presentation, mentioned around class coverage reduction. Is this for, I can't think, it's the end of the day, for substitute teachers?
So that's a combination. I'll let Zach jump in because we've been looking at this very deeply, Councilwoman.
Yeah, so class coverage is typically when there's a vacancy or an absence and an individual in that building covers that classroom and receives additional pay through kind of better scheduling for some of our positions, related service providers, as well as what we hope, believe, and are on track to have fewer vacancies for next year. That would result in less spend on class coverage.
So as you design this, this budget presentation, was in correlation with some of the things that are happening in the negotiation process around the teacher's contract, because one of the within the teacher's contract, one of the things that have come up, and which I've read and I'm sure many people have seen, is the number of sick days that are allotted to each teacher. So is that something that's under discussion within the contract process, and how do you mitigate that in terms of like absenteeism to ensure that, teachers are present? And I'm sure teachers need to use that, but I know that they have the ability to bank a lot of the sick time. And so in many schools within the course of a week or a month, you'll see like repeatedly the same teacher absent. And on a weekly basis, these classes are being, broken up, or they have a substitute. So that's number one. Two, I think one of my biggest concerns with this presentation or this proposal is that there's no programmatic, there's no like allocation for any programmatic resources. And I paid attention to the numbers. I've been looking at these numbers for quite some time. We also have to remember these proficiency numbers are from a test that was recently implemented. We also have to take into consideration that our state has used 3 different testing components in the last 5 years or so, right? How long have I been back to Rhode Island? 6 years. So the last 6 years. So I don't necessarily think that those numbers are valid, considering that we've used a different testing model in the past. And we all know in Massachusetts, it took them a while. It took them over 20 years for them to get to where they're at today. So that's number 2. And number 3, in terms of transportation costs, and increasing or reducing the distance from the schools, has the school district considered utilizing the student's ID to serve as a bus pass? Because I know that the cost to print out those RIPTA bus passes is quite significant. So what is the district doing in terms of like looking at how to reduce just the maintenance costs of these RIPTA passes? I like Brown University, you can actually use your student ID, your faculty ID to get on RIPTA. You just swipe it. I just don't understand why the district, and this is something that has come up repeatedly, but why the district has not implemented that type of ability so that the students can use their bus pass rather than spend, thousands of dollars on your yearly basis on that. Hold on, just looking at some of my notes. Also, with the hiring process of teachers, are the principals engaged in that process? Because what some of the reportings have said is that principals are looking for more autonomy because they understand the needs of the schools. My concern is that a lot of investments are top heavy and it's not bottom up. So I just want to make sure that the principals are engaged in these conversations, but more importantly, what type of programmatic initiatives are we allocating funds towards? Because what we do know that can increase, and there is data that supports that can increase student achievement, is really investing in the student, investing in programming to better support our students. And also for the per pupil expenditure, what is it per student less operational costs? Because I understand allocating funds, categorical funds for ELL, but we do not take in consideration that that is not populated into the funding formula. So less the operational costs, what is the per pupil expenditure? Because what I'm seeing is that we're spending most of our money or the resources is going into salaries, but not necessarily into students.
Yeah.
So I would love to see those numbers.
Right. Loaded questions. Great questions, though. Typically, when you look across the nation, most school districts, and every school district I ever worked in, north of 80 to 85% of your budget is salary. We work in a labor-intensive organization, and it takes a lot of people to run this organization. So you could almost just assume that minimum of 80% of your budget. And these are just even financially sound districts that are very, very lean. 80% of your budget is going to be people. That's just what it is. The second piece is I'd love to talk a little bit about more the vision around programs or programmatic changes. Programs don't change schools. People change schools. And when I got here, we had programs, and no data around what's working, what's not working, but we wanted to purchase more programs. So I would argue that we have to be thoughtful around the programs that we do bring in to make sure that they align to the mission critical priorities that we set. We do believe in this notion of getting student rip the pass IDs so that it curve some of those costs. And I think that's the power of this conversation. Every cost cutting measure that we can use, that we can reallocate funding to schools, we want to be able to do it. So you won't find a more agreeable, amenable superintendent to these efficiencies. I think that is absolutely critical.
Superintendent, just a point of clarification. So in terms of in terms of programs, that has always been one issue for me in terms of assessment. But we also do the same thing for technology. You're asking for additional resources for technology, but just a few years ago we spent funding on Skyward. Then a year later, they purchased another system similar to Skyward, yet we don't assess how these tools are utilized, or if we don't assess the efficacy of these tools. So we do the same for technology. The presentation is not, there's not a lot of data that's associated with this presentation or aligned. So it would be great to see a little bit more.
We'd be more than happy to bring data. We wanted to make sure that we brought forth a balanced budget to the council. And I agree, whenever you have, when you go out to bid for a program or a service, there should be an assessment that goes with it. That's what I'm used to. Now with technology, we have to have an ask because we're in a distant learning environment, and we know that we're not going to get all the devices back. We also know that there's significant repair and wear and tear on devices that we've got to, and every school district has a technology refresher plan. The devices just get old. So you'll buy 1,000 this year, and in a year and a half, if that long, they'll be outdated, where you still have other thousands that you have to replenish. And the idea about the assessment, I agree with you. But I think we have to be careful in Rhode Island by putting ourselves in the bubbling on an island. We have to compete with every other state in the nation. Every other state and kids in the nation are taking the SAT and the ACT. No matter what test you take, if it's RICAS, if it's the Florida assessment or California assessment, 2 + 2 is 2. And
But that's not true, Superintendent, because when you're controlling for certain things, I mean, think about what California is doing, where now they're saying that they're going to eliminate the SAT requirements. But if you're controlling for poverty indicators, when you're controlling for looking at if a school is in an urban area or a rural area or a suburban area, when you're controlling for other demographics like gender and race or ELL, it's really hard to compare a district. You have to be controlling for the same things to be able to compare our district with any other district in the state as well as in the country. We have a significant amount of EL learners. So you can't compare our district with a district that might have less ELL learners. And we know studies have shown that these are factors that impede on students' ability to succeed academically. So we do need additional resources because our students need additional resources to be more successful.
yeah, we're not arguing that. We absolutely agree with needed resources. And I understand about the control group. The reality is there are many school districts that reflect the demographics of Providence. We are not on an island. We are no different than the south side of Chicago, where half of my schools were 60% Hispanic, or in but time and time again, we're underperforming when compared to like school districts. That's real, and that data is there. I understand about testing bias, but it's testing bias for all those populations of kids that reflect our kids. So I think the reality is I've never seen proficiency scores like this. And again, that's one part of the picture. I had a conversation with a group of teachers today. That's one part of the picture. That's one test. But then when you walk through schools, when you look at other assessments, when you look at other points of data, it's very clear that we're not competing. So yeah, I don't want to take one assessment and make an assertion, but I think we can take multiple data points to begin to paint a very stark picture that we're just not competing.
You're also talking about a district in a state that has used 3 or 4 different test models within how many years. So it's just, I just think that we have to be very cautious when we're just basing everything on these test scores, considering our students' needs. And you know what? We are on an island. This is Rhode Island. But we also, sidebar, but we also have to, I'm glad you found that funny. We do have to look at our district, and we have to consider the things that impact our students and what they have and resources that they have access to. And I get it. I understand we need to, hire talented individuals who are teaching our kids, who are working in our school district. But I also want to make sure that we're spending on resources to better support our students' needs. And it's not just only on salaries. So, which is why it's important for me to see what the per pupil expenditure is, less the operational expenses, to see how much we're truly investing in our students. That's number one. And number two, I understand we want to have, we want to make sure that our students receive a quality education. But you know what? Our state constitution doesn't even require our students to have an adequate education. So, I mean, we have a long ways to go. And 3, I just don't see the programmatic expenditures. This is very salary heavy. And with a district, with everything that our district has gone through, I just want to see more investment in our students.
I just want to do a check-in. I know Councilwoman LaFortune, you had 4 questions. I have Chairman Igliosi raised his hand, he's waiting. And I just want to check with him if his question is related to the discussion. Chairman Igliosi?
Yes, Madam President, I just want to ask, have they supplied the actual budget documents? The actual comp and classification documents, or is it just simply this presentation, this PowerPoint? And if it's just, so that's the first question. The second question is, if they haven't, when can we actually see the true budget documents? Yes. Comp, classification, positions, value, all that stuff truly broken down like a real budget. Where is that thing? Where is that item? When and when can we get it and how soon?
Yep.
So it's overarching and that. So I just wanted to ask that. Do we have that? Can we get an answer to that right now?
Yes, so we, as you saw, so we have, we will provide that. We are in the midst of, getting state revenue figures, and what we shared is there could be a $15 million swing. So what we have is what you saw, some of the details on the scenario 2, which is our kind of baseline budget, knowing it may fluctuate up or down. As we get clarity on state revenue and as we finalize some of the, the cuts we were mentioning, to close any budget gap we have, that is, that what I would expect in the next few weeks. But it's been, when you have a $15 million swing, we don't want to put out personnel cuts that may not have to come to fruition. Obviously, we may need to proceed with uncertainty, but we want to do so in a respectful manner. So,
may I interject in this? My concern is this: I appreciate that you use the word respect, but you're not going to know until who knows when the legislature passes this budget, which is probably going to be, I presume, deep in June and July. So, and the council's in the process of going through its budget process right now. So what I'm trying to understand is, when will you're telling me you have this proposed budget, have some items, but you don't want to give us detail on it. Well, you're putting us at a dramatic disadvantage, considering you're looking for money from us. And by the way, we have to be accountable to the people also. And my concern is that this is more about like, this is what we're going to do. And we informed you, thank you very much, and just send us a check. My concern is that when are we going to get the details of this budget? And we need to get it before we end up passing our budget in the city council. That's a fundamental fundamental aspect of our budget process. I mean, you are looking for 130 some odd million,
Yeah. May I just add,
Councilwoman
Council President? Thank you. Regardless of who is in control of the district right now, at the end of the day, about 1/3 of the city's budget is the school districts. That's number one, which means it's our tax dollars. It's our every one of our constituents right here, city council members, tax dollars, our tax dollars. I'm a resident. I have children in the district. It's our tax dollars. It's our investment that's going into the district. So our community deserves access to the budget and to understand how this money is being spent, how many people you plan to hire. And I mean, to be fair,
we don't disagree. We agree.
To be fair, I mean, just the PowerPoint.
If you agree, then I think you should.
It's not enough. It's not sufficient.
Councilwoman LaFortune is correct. If you do agree with us, then you should utilize that word respect and then provide that information to us in a more timely manner. I.e., if you don't want to give it to us, then you should give it to the internal audit of the city council and our financial team, so then they can do a breakdown and an assessment and then can inform the council members and we can look at it accordingly. So it should be a two-way street. And I agree with Councilwoman LaFortune. We should know what exactly you want to do with the millions of dollars we are going to give you, and what kind of product and what kind of school system are we recreating, hopefully one that we can all be proud of.
Yeah.
And so the idea that's 3 or 4 weeks out and we may, and we're still not going to get it is an unacceptable answer as far as my concern is.
I don't think
that's where I am.
I don't think that we said 3 or 4 weeks. So we have been working
Victor?
with. Sorry, Madam President.
No. Go ahead, Victor.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to clarify that we have been in communications with the city's team, and that we have right now, the scenario that we have is with the information that we have, which will include the increase from the state. We have been making sure that what we provide is the most accurate information to date, but the information that we have to date includes the March update, which will include, as Zach presented, an increase. So we have been working with the team, and we can provide that information.
Madam President, I just asked.
Chairman Iglesias.
Thank you, Madam President. I don't know what team Mr. Campiano is talking about. I don't know. I presume it's the administration, but we're the legislative branch of government. So it's important that our financial team knows what's going on to inform the council. And then also, we need specifics. And you can give us what your hopeful budget is, and then of course, what your potential budget that's cut. So it seems like you have two scenarios, really. One is the hopeful one where you get the additional, $15+ million. And the other one is where it's almost level funded or less. So, I mean, that seems to me it's not that big of a mystery. And the question is, so you should have pretty much not much, a good percentage of both budgets are not going to change whether you get the additional funding or not, a good percentage. So there's a lot of specifics that can be known and discussed, and that information can be relayed to the council's financial team today versus in 3 or 4 weeks, a month from now. So it's really, you have two budget scenarios. That's what you're telling us. So you have them written down, just submit them to the finance team and they'll review it. And this way the council can prepare for either scenario and then also have follow-up questions, which I'm sure council members do, on the potential budgets of either or. So I'd ask.
I want to check with Councilman Taylor, raise his hand. If any other council member wants to speak, please use the feature in the raising your hand so I can make notice of that. Councilman Taylor, you were waiting?
Yeah, just quickly, transportation. How much are we saving or did we save this year with transportation? Do we know? Because obviously we have the buses, everything has been working since March. Is there a savings? What I didn't see that in there.
You mean for FY20?
Yeah.
Yeah, we are projecting to see savings there. Obviously there's, with the shutdown, there are additional costs and other revenues that we're foregoing that kind of balance out, but we are seeing, without service, some savings. And we're in constant contact with First Student about both FY20 and then planning for reentry.
Do you have a rough figure on that or no?
I think it was like roughly $4 to $5 million. I think it depends. Some of it depends on the baseline. Whether you're talking, sometimes the field trips and other services can cause a fluctuation, but that is like a rough estimate based on the kind of run rate. And again, that's one area of savings. We're also seeing some declines in revenue for Medicaid and food services that we're trying to compensate for.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I see that Chairman Iglesias still has his hands raised. Chairman Iglesias, you have another question?
Just very quickly, Madam President, I just would like my question answered. Can we receive the both proposed budgets, the either or budget, ASAP, to our financial team so we can get a sense of what's going on? In all due respect to the school department, us council members are advocates of the school system. So it's not necessarily about us not supporting it. It's us being well informed. So then if we want to champion the cause, which I'm sure most of us do, we now have the tools to champion said cause, and we can lobby our reps and senators and the local and the folks up in the State House if we so choose. So you have an opportunity to empower us to help empower you to create the school system you feel that could turn the system around. But the first step is openness and true transparency and submitting those either or budgets to us. So I'd like to still have the answer to my question. Will you submit those budgets either or to the council's financing team this week or by today? Yes or no? It's a pretty simple question.
Because
Victor?
I can't guarantee it by today, but we'll absolutely submit it. We have no problem with that. I mean, we totally agree that it's a public document, the public should know. But I can't say, yeah, we'll have it today, but we'll absolutely get it to the council. It's not a problem. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Yeah. Any other questions from Councilman Espinal? You have a question?
Yes, it's for Superintendent Peters. Good evening. How much exactly are you looking for from the city for your budget at this time? Do we have a number on that?
Yeah, so there is a slide that we estimated the city's contributions. You don't have to tee it up, but you want to talk to that real quick?
Yeah, so it's driven by the city's obligation is driven by the state's increase in aid, which at that 15 at the kind of based on the governor's proposal and the March date update translated to a roughly $5.8 million from the city. So, that could vary depending on what the state aid to Providence school, to Rhode Island schools ultimately ends. But that's what's driven in this, that is based on the state aid that we, was based on the governor's proposal and the March enrollment updates.
And Superintendent, you said that 80 to 85% of that is going to go to salaries and benefits.
Typically with most organizations, school districts, you'll see 80 to maybe 88% of a school district's budget going straight to salaries. That's typical trends from the Council of Great City Schools as they do analysis of all types of school districts across the country. And you can pretty much guarantee about 80 to 85, 87%.
Well, I would personally have a tough time selling that to the parents at Harvard school when they're performing at 1% and doing math. I mean, that's the uphill battle that we're going to be facing as council people when we actually decide to allocate the money that you need. So I think we need transparency, and we need to really show the parents and the taxpayers that this money that we're willing to give you is really going to be used wisely, and that the scores are really going to increase because it's really tough. It makes you want to cry because I believe that school has at least 700 or 800 kids, and that 1% is doing math at grade level. That's really sad. And I am also a parent of a student in the Providence school system. So as a council person, as a taxpayer, as a parent, I come to you in this manner because it's really sad. So whatever we need to do, we rely on you as a new superintendent to really lead us and lead us to a better future for our kids.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I just want to ask a question in regards to the RIPTA bus passes. Were you able to make any progress to switch from buying a full month pass to buying the individual passes in the meantime until we have a more robust solution, maybe the one that Councilwoman LaFortune mentioned?
Yeah, so we've explored that a bit with RIPTA, and it'll connect a bit to the Councilwoman LaFortune's question. So we had considered doing the usage passes. Now, I think on a strict per cost basis for a normal month, that actually might be more expensive than I think it's $20 maybe for 10 rides, but it would be a little bit more expensive than the monthly pass. And we would want to make sure that if it's on a usage basis, that if a student were to, we know a number of students use it for athletics or work, we wouldn't want them to run out of passes and then be in jeopardy of not getting to school. But understanding the spirit of what this is, what we have been in discussions with is moving to a single pass, because what that would allow us to do, aside from the waste but behind the waste, it actually allows us to track usage a little better, because one of the things we've talked with RIPTA, and we're still in discussions with it, and frankly, most of our discussions have in the past weeks have focused on starting school, given the uncertainty there. But having a single pass would allow us to track usage and potentially pay per use, because we might find that some students don't every day, and therefore we could potentially save some money. But right now we don't have great usage data, so we don't know if paying per usage would save us money or not. But I think moving to a single pass, aside from making it potentially easier, would allow us to track usage, and then better, if it determines that we were to find that actually on a per usage basis, we could get better costs, and RIPTA were agreeable, we might pursue that further. So that has been something we've been exploring further. We don't have a concrete agreement on that. Again, we've been trying to think through, starting next year, if buses are at half capacity, how we ensure we're getting all of our high school students to school, depending on the instructional model we go with.
What are, oh, sorry.
Councilwoman LaFortune?
Thank you. What are we doing in terms of looking at moving towards a neighborhood school model to reduce this cost of transportation? Because right now there's like school choice, and parents, would kind of sign up or be placed in, they can sign up to go to.
We lost audio, Councilwoman LaFortune.
Madam President, I think I may have gotten the spirit of Councilwoman LaFortune's question.
Okay.
I did get it. It's about what are we doing to look at a neighborhood option as a cost.
So have you thought about, moving towards a neighborhood school model to reduce the cost of transportation?
Okay. Superintendent?
Yes, ma'am. So everything's on the table. Everything that allows us to be a more efficient organization in this time of crisis is a consideration. So the team is in the middle of running the numbers. Do we have the capacity to even ask families to return to their neighborhood schools? So we've got to first run a capacity study. But again, that option among a number of other options are on the table to be considered.
Well, maybe not asking families to return, but perhaps even going forward, maybe having some sort of timeline where, have a plan where by this year, AY, whatever, that we will start enrolling, focusing more on enrollment in school neighborhoods. But we also want to make sure that all our schools are doing well academically, and
Yes,
they
ma'am.
have other resources to support their students and teachers.
Yes, ma'am. No question.
Chairman Iglesias has his hands raised.
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to dovetail on the RIPTA question. RIPTA's budget's about $100 million a year. RIPTA's receiving an additional $100 million from the $1.2 billion from the federal government just given to them. Have you guys discussed with RIPTA that maybe they can, for this upcoming fiscal year, that with that $100 million of additional money they're getting from the federal government to run their operations, they could potentially either diminish or gratis the city of Providence's school, the RIPTA system for the Providence school system during this process? That's the first question I have, and then I have a second one. But can you answer that one first? Have you had that conversation with them yet?
Not only RIPTA, but just about all the contracts that we've had, we've reassessed because of the financial crisis and asked if there's an opportunity to renegotiate or if there's some type of discount, because our vendors are challenged as well. And they know the spending difficulties or the cliffs that we have. So we've gone back to many of our vendors and asked them to reconsider the contract prices and see if there's any leeway of us have some reduced costs, whether it's materials, supplies, services. Many of those things, it's not RIPTA, but many of those services now are online, which significantly decreases travel costs for maybe consultants or things like that. So the answer is not only RIPTA, but all the agencies that we work with, we've tried to re-engage them around lower prices.
And then I just want to follow up on the talk about the different schools. Now, proficiency scores, I saw your PowerPoint. Actually, that's not surprising. I know the past couple of years, the council and I have spoken about it on the floor numerous times on those horrific proficiency scores. And I've even said that it seems like the school department's goal was to be, instead of race to the top, was race to the bottom. And by the way, unfortunately, they did a good job. And I don't mean that in a complimentary way. My question is that when you've been into the system for 9 months and you've looked at each school and let's look at all the different high schools. Have you done a checkoff list of what you expect what a school should have and what school, and for example, your ideal high school should have X. These are the elements, this is what it is, safety, whatever the number, principal, vice principal, that kind of stuff, and then made an assessment. Let's just do with the high schools, each high school, and then put a value point to what that is. And then also, even though that's what you think is the ideal elements for that high school, how do we know, how can you convey to us that those scores will go up? Not just, by the way, not like when they say the scores went up 100%, that means it went from 1% to 2%. I'm talking about the scores go up in a serious, substantial manner. Because I've heard this numerous times, numerous superintendents, and they go, the scores went up 100%. Right, you went from 1% to 2%. Everybody says great, and they call it a day. So can you connect those two pieces, meaning the elements that you're looking for in high school, right? The elements that you feel that are missing in that high school, and then how do those elements translate into greater proficiency scores? Does that make sense?
That's a perfect question. And I think that I will answer that in a couple ways. The first thing that, and what I'll talk about now, it's the work that's happening right now on the ground. I think the first thing we have to reach consensus around as a group is, what is that profile of a graduate? When a student walks across the stage in PPSD, what is that profile that we're gearing to? We know that schools are the economic engines of our communities. Every graduate, when you walk across the stage with that piece of paper, that increases your earning potential over life about 450,000. You multiply that times 2,000 graduates, that's probably close to $1 billion in earning potential of money that's back into the local economy. So when kids don't graduate ready, that significantly hurts that number. So what do we agree that the profile of a graduate is? The second piece is this whole high school redesign that we're entering. How do we look at high school differently? I think Councilman LaFortune landed the plane and hit a home run when she talked about schools are different, school districts are different. So we have to think differently around each high school. And are we providing high quality options? And to the other part of your question, Mr. Chairman, is there's a school effectiveness framework. What are the effective elements of a school that are just baseline across all schools? And we're norming around that then. And then I think as you look at what that effectiveness framework, what are those foundational positions that should be in every school? And I'll just give you, this is not high school, but I didn't realize that we didn't have guidance counselors in every elementary school. I mean, that is something that I didn't realize, and we cannot have that. We absolutely have to figure out how we reprioritize and ensure that every school has at least one guidance counselor, at least one assistant principal to lift the work. So when we talk about the critical elements, it's those things. And then a clear and viable curriculum. We have to have a curriculum that's green on ed reports. Teachers have to have the development, and that's what we talked about earlier when you I think aptly talked about the contract. We got to get to a contract that's student-centered, that allows teachers the flexibility, principals and community the flexibility to design their programs that fit the needs of their students. So a school effectiveness framework that aligns what effective schools do. B, the profile of a graduate. What does that graduate look like walking across a PPSD stage? And what are those foundational positions that need to be in place, along with the curriculum, the resources, the planning, all of those things that will be in that school effectiveness framework. And then I think you've got to get the people that can move and operationalize that vision.
Chairman Iglesias, you all set?
Just one follow-up, Madam President, if I may.
Go
I
ahead.
was wondering also, in my limited experience, I feel that the Providence system, unfortunately, where we lose our high school students, we lose them in the middle school. And what happens is that they come out of the middle school without the tools to be prepared for high school, and then it just magnifies, and then it causes more problems. Do you have a middle school, how do I put it, program or middle school initiative? Because what I've seen is, and that's where that age group, that's where we start losing them. They become young adults. They're going through all sorts of different issues, of course, their bodies are changing, et cetera. The way they think is changing. Their family their family lifestyle, all of a sudden they have more greater recognition of maybe a family unit or a non-family unit, and that they become more aware of what's happening around them. And if they don't have enough guidance in the school system, and I'm glad you mentioned guidance, we lose them in high school. So would part of the middle school initiative be, I always felt that there should be like almost like a dean type of system, you know, in the middle school, a dean system, and then also a beefed up guidance counselor, day-to-day conversation. Like your job is to make sure you check in with these 25 kids every day. Your job is checking these other 25, and they have someone or they have access to someone who can help them, by the way, unfortunately, deal with some serious challenges that these young men and women are facing. By the way, I'm not talking about even just besides the normal ones. I'm talking about, you know, the men, the young children in my neighborhood, in my ward, you know, they face some difficult challenges. Their parents do, you know, and, you know, their parents may work 2 or 3 jobs, no one's home. And do you have an initiative, part of this plan, or if it's not this, coming into fruition, where there'll be a truly middle school initiative, you know, to plant the flag and say, we're going to turn it around here. So will an impact in high school there? So I ask you that, Superintendent.
Let me tell you something. That is, oh my God, what a great question, and what a powerful sort of statement you've made. I was an elementary school teacher. I was a middle school principal and a high school principal. There's a special place in heaven for those folks in middle school. I'll just tell you that right now.
It is.
What you'll see is a couple things. First of all, you'll see us move to a 6-12 articulation. How do you marry middle school and high school? And I said earlier that in the distance learning scenario, I'd look for an opportunity to maybe bring those transition years back to school, the 6th graders and the 9th graders, because you're right, those years are so important. So yes, there will be an extreme focus on middle school, and we're pretty apt to support that work. And then there are actual metrics that we use. At the 9th grade level is freshman on track, attendance, behavior, course performance. How are you tracking? Then there's middle school on track. And then you have built in your guidance periods, your periods with your mentors and your social emotional support. Like all of those things have to run in concert to be able to ensure that we've got middle schools that are high performant, that are serving the vast needs of a community of students who are just in a very different space. So I think I hear you loud and clear, and the answer is absolutely, most definitely, you will definitely see a difference in middle school. It's a great.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Chairman Iglesias. Any further questions? Any other council members have any questions?
Madam President, it's Councilman Salvatore.
Councilman Salvatore, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam President. Superintendent, thank you for your presentation. One of the hot button topics that was brought up last year during the community meetings surrounding the Johns Hopkins reports was procurement. And the fact that there were so many layers of bureaucracy and we weren't getting the resources to our school building administrators and into the hands of our teachers who needed those resources the most. Can you update the council in terms of any progress that has been made in minimizing the layers of bureaucracy around procurement?
Councilman Salvatore, thank you for that question. And the answer is yes, we're ready to press play. Zach, you want to talk about the particulars and perhaps the thresholds to make sure around the procurement process?
Yeah, so that was, thank you for that. That is something obviously that came through loud and clear in the Johns Hopkins report. And we have met with a number of folks, both from the state the purchasing team, as well as knowledgeable folks at the city to talk through alternative process that we think, you know, obviously maintains the compliance we need, while also expediting and getting resources to school in a timely fashion at competitive prices. So in that, we develop a process that will include thresholds for review and approval. Obviously, we still follow, I think, you know, everything above $5,000 will need to go out for a competitive bid. That is not something that is subject to change and that we will continue to follow. but we'll have approvals at thresholds below 200,000 approved by the superintendent and and staff from RIDE. And then anything above that will need to be reviewed by school board finance with recommendations provided publicly to the superintendent commissioner for their review and approval. So, you know, again, trying to throughout ensure compliance with all state laws and procurement practices, but also wanting to find ways to expedite the process while maintaining transparency.
Thank you. So just so we're clear, the new threshold for approval is anything less than 200,000 would be an administrative process, and anything above $200,000 would require additional approvals. Is that correct?
It's like partly. I'd say there are multiple approvers for things below 200,000, so they still need to be reviewed by the superintendent and RIDE and the commissioner's office. So they're separate entities, external entities reviewing it. It is that 200K threshold that adds the additional school board review to it.
Okay, so as you know, the city's code of ordinances requires any contract above $5,000 would require city council approval. Can you clarify that? Through the Crowley Act, we've shared this with folks we've met with in the city, that the city ordinance around city council approval would not apply above 5,000. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Councilman. Any other questions from any other council members? Yep. I just want to ask the question. The chairman was asking for the documentation to come in front of the city council. Which documents can we expect? I don't, probably by now you have looked at what were the documents that normally came to us every year from the school department. Now under the Crowley Act, what is it that we should be expecting that's going to be coming from you?
Yes, ma'am. Zach, you want to review the documents that we're preparing?
Sure. So I think similarly, the format might look different, but it will include, I think the object code level data that talks about spending by different categories, and we'll have department level detail with FTEs, both department and school level spend broken down as well. And then whether it looks exactly like that, but meets the same information as the compensation and classification requirements that outlay what our budget looks like, similar to what was done before historically.
Thank you. Any further questions from any council members? All right, asking one final time. Any further questions from any council members?
Madam President? Madam President?
Chairman Iglesias, yes.
I presume when we finally get this information on the A budget and the B budget proposal, will there be another follow-up conversation with the school department, or is this the only one?
Chairman Iglesias, I'll be glad to invite them again for another city council as a whole meeting, so everyone has a chance to ask questions. So I don't see a problem with that.
Right.
Would you guys be willing to join us again for one of these conversations? Superintendent?
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I was on mute. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah, so we can have another city council as a whole to have the opportunity for everyone to ask questions.
Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Chairman. All right, with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Superintendent, for the presentation, Zach, Victor, and I know Aris also. Thank you so much for the time and for the information. We're looking forward to getting those documentations from you and for our next gathering. So thank you all for participating. Could I have a motion to adjourn, please?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Is that a second? Motion has been made and second to adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.